Elara Vance was a woman made of silence and granite. She lived on the far edge of the town of Providence, where the settled land frayed into wilderness. Her husband, Elias, had died 2 winters past, leaving her with 3 things of value. The first was the quarter section of rocky land itself, deemed unfit for proper farming by the townsfolk. The second was a stoic, broad-chested horse named Shale, whose coat was the colour of wet river stones. The third, and most important, was a stack of leather-bound journals. They were filled with Elias's spidery handwriting, and before that, his father's, and his grandfather's before that. The Vance men had not been scholars. They had been watchers. They watched the sky and the trees and the behaviour of animals. They recorded the depth of the frost and the dates the geese flew south. They made meticulous notes on geology, on the way water moved underground, and on the immense, patient power of snow. Elara had read the journals until the ink was as familiar to her as the lines on her own hands. In the spring of 1888, she began her project. It was not a whim. It was a conclusion, drawn from generations of recorded observation. The journals spoke of a cycle, a pattern of brutal winters that came every 50 years, give or take. The signs, they warned, were subtle at first, but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Elara saw the signs. She planned a structure she called the Winterfast. It was not to be a house in the conventional sense. It was to be a shelter, an extension of the earth itself, dug into the south-facing slope of the great granite hill that dominated her property. It would be an earth-sheltered dwelling, its principles ancient and sound. It would have a deep pantry, cooled by the constant temperature of the deep earth. It would have a primary living space, warmed by a small, efficient stove and a single, clever ventilation flue that drew air up from a geothermal vent Elias had discovered deep in the rock. Its roof would be made of thick timber beams, waterproofed with tar and clay, and then covered with 3 feet of sod. The sod roof was designed not to shed the snow, but to hold it. The snow, Elias's grandfather had written, was the finest blanket God ever made. Her plan was complete. It was logical. It was necessary. But it required more stone than she could pull from her own fields. She went to see the mayor. Mayor Thompson was a man whose importance was measured by the tautness of his waistcoat. He sat behind a large oak desk, a monument to civic order and self-satisfaction. Elara stood before him, a plain woman in a faded calico dress, and explained her request. She wished for permission to quarry loose stone from the communal plot north of town. She explained the purpose, the design, the reasoning. The mayor listened with a look of pained indulgence. When she finished, he steepled his fingers and leaned back in his chair, the lever groaning in protest. "An underground house, Mistress Vance?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "An earth-sheltered dwelling," she corrected, her voice quiet but firm. "It uses the mass of the hill for insulation." "It sounds like a root cellar," the mayor said. "A rather ambitious root cellar." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Providence is a modern town," he declared, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "We build with milled lumber and square nails. We build upwards toward the sky, not downwards into the dirt like badgers." He denied her request. "My advice to you, as a widow, is to sell that useless plot of land and take a room in town. It is not proper for a woman to live alone, let alone engage in this kind of project." Elara did not argue. She simply nodded, turned, and left his office. The story, however, did not stay in his office. It spread through Providence like a summer fever. Dr. Finch, a man who believed science was contained entirely within the pages of the books he owned, heard of it at the general store. "Preposterous," he announced to the gathered customers. "Living in the damp earth is a direct invitation to lung fever and rheumatism. The air would be stagnant, filled with pestilence. It is fundamentally unhealthy, unscientific." The townspeople, who revered the doctor's education, nodded in grave agreement. The most vocal critic was Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy was the richest man in the valley. He owned 1,000 head of cattle and believed his wealth was a direct reflection of his superior intelligence. He was in the process of building a new barn, a colossal structure that was the talk of the county. It was a testament to modern progress, with a vast, open interior and a sweeping roof supported by complex trusses he had designed himself. It stood proud and tall on the open prairie, a challenge to the sky itself. He found Elara's project deeply, personally amusing. "A gopher hole!" he would bellow in the saloon, slapping his thigh. "The widow Vance is digging herself a gopher hole." He gave the project its name, Vance's Folly. The name stuck. It became a joke, a piece of local folklore. The town children would sneak to the edge of her property to watch her work, whispering and giggling about the mad widow digging her own grave. Soon, the phrase evolved. If a man spent money on a losing gamble, his friends would say he was digging a Vance. If a farmer planted a crop in a poor field, his neighbors would shake their heads and mutter that he was pulling a Vance. It meant to do something foolish, to work against all common sense. Elara heard the whispers. She saw the smirks when she went to town for supplies. She paid them no mind. The mockery of others was a weather she could endure. Denied the communal stone, she turned to her own land. The work began. It was a slow, brutal, methodical process. Every morning, she rose before the sun. She and Shale would journey to the rock-strewn northern edge of her property. She used levers and iron bars, the simple physics of leverage taught in Elias's journals, to pry half-buried fieldstones from the earth's grip. These were not neat, quarried blocks. They were stubborn, irregular boulders, heavy with the weight of ages. She and Shale would haul them one by one on a stone boat, a heavy wooden sledge that scraped a deep furrow in the soil. The journey to the construction site was a quarter of a mile. They made the trip 10, 12, sometimes 15 times a day. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and hard as cured leather. Her back and shoulders ached with a fire that never fully went out. But she did not stop. The first summer was spent excavating. She dug into the hillside, a cavity 30 feet wide and 40 feet deep. She did not use dynamite. She used a pickaxe, a shovel, and time. Shale, hitched to a slip scraper, hauled away tons of earth, dumping it in a carefully planned berm on the north side of the excavation, an extra layer of protection against the winter wind. The town watched her progress with detached amusement. The hole in the hill grew deeper, the pile of stones grew larger. The second year, she began to build. She laid a foundation of the largest, flattest stones, fitting them together like a vast, complex puzzle. She built the retaining walls herself, following the diagrams in the journals. The walls were not perfectly vertical. They had a slight inward cant, a batter designed to brace against the immense pressure of the earth behind them. Each stone was chosen and placed with painstaking care, the smaller chinks filled with a mortar of clay and lime. She was not just a laborer, she was a craftsman, an engineer working from a proven text. She designed the ventilation system with meticulous precision. The intake shaft was long and low, lined with stones. As air was drawn through it in winter, the surrounding earth would warm it before it ever reached the living space. The outtake flue, placed high on the back wall and running up through 20 feet of earth, would create a constant, gentle draft, pulling stale air out and fresh air in. It was a simple, brilliant system, powered by the laws of thermodynamics. By the end of the second summer, the stone walls were complete. The massive timber beams, which she had shaped herself with an adze and a broadaxe, were hoisted into place with a block and tackle rigged to a sturdy oak. She covered them with planks, then with layers of tar-soaked felt, then with a thick, impermeable layer of clay. Finally, she and Shale spent a month hauling the excavated topsoil back up, spreading it 3 feet deep over the entire structure. She seeded it with native grasses whose roots would form a dense, living blanket. Vance's Folly had disappeared. It was once again part of the hill, a gentle, grass-covered mound with a single, stout wooden door and 2 small, deep-set windows facing south. She spent the next few months finishing the interior and stocking the pantry. She slaughtered her 2 pigs and cured the meat. She harvested her massive garden, canning and drying vegetables and fruit. The shelves of the deep pantry groaned with jars of beans, corn, tomatoes, preserved peaches, and smoked hams. She had enough food and firewood to last a year. The project was finished. 2 years of her life poured into the earth. The third autumn arrived, September of 1890, and the signs began. Elara noticed them immediately. The squirrels, normally bold and chattering, were frantic, their movements sharp and desperate. They were not just gathering nuts, they were burying them at impossible depths, digging with a feverish intensity. The high-altitude geese, usually a fixture until late October, passed over in the 3rd week of September. Their formations were not the usual lazy V's. They were tight, silent arrows, flying high and fast, their honks spare and urgent. There was a strange silence to the woods. The crickets stopped their evening song a month early. The birds seemed to have vanished overnight. On the morning of October 19th, Elara tasted it on the wind. A faint, metallic scent, like cold steel. It was a sign Elias's grandfather had noted only twice in his long life, both times preceding winters of mythic violence. She went inside and checked the old brass barometer mounted on the wall. The needle had fallen so far, so fast, that she tapped the glass, certain it was broken. It was not broken. She knew what was coming. She began her final preparations. There was no panic in her movements, only a calm, deliberate efficiency. She brought the last of the split firewood into the antechamber of the Winterfast, stacking it neatly against the stone wall. She checked the seals on her small windows, ensuring they were airtight. She went to her old log cabin, the house where she and Elias had lived, and boarded its windows, securing it as best she could. It was now just a storehouse for tools and memories. She led Shale from his pasture into the small, sturdy stable she had built as an extension of the Winterfast, its back wall shared with the main dwelling. It was sheltered and secure. For a moment, she stood at the door of her new home and looked down toward Providence. The lights of the town twinkled in the dusk. She could hear the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the faint laughter from the saloon. Life was proceeding as it always did, oblivious. A part of her felt a pang of duty, a need to warn them, to ride into town and shout her prophecy in the square. But the memory of the laughter stopped her. She remembered the mayor's condescending smile, the doctor's arrogant pronouncements, Mr. Abernathy's booming ridicule. They would not listen. They would call her the mad widow of the hill, a hysterical woman frightened by an early frost. Her warning would only be met with more scorn, cementing their own prideful ignorance. Her duty was not to them. It was to the truth that Elias had left her. It was to the wisdom written in the journals. She turned her back on the town. She went inside the Winterfast, closed the thick oak door, and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The sound echoed in the quiet space. A sound of finality. The storm did not arrive for another 12 days. They were 12 days of eerie, unnatural calm. The sky was a strange, bruised purple at dawn and dusk. The air was perfectly still. In Providence, the people called it a beautiful Indian summer. They planned a Halloween social. On the morning of October 31st, the sky turned the color of lead. The storm arrived at precisely 2:15 in the afternoon. It did not come as a gentle snowfall. It came as a physical blow. A wall of wind, moving at 80 miles an hour, struck the valley, and with it came not snow, but ice. A horizontal blizzard of frozen pellets that scoured the paint from houses and shattered windows on their north-facing walls. The sound was not a howl. It was a shriek, a constant, high-pitched scream of air and ice that felt like the world tearing itself apart. In town, chaos erupted. People fought to board their broken windows, the wind ripping the hammers from their numb hands. Mr. Abernathy's magnificent barn, his monument to progress, lasted less than an hour. Its vast, gently sloped roof acted like a wing, catching the full force of the wind. The structure groaned, the timbers screaming in protest. With a crack that sounded like a cannonade, the main ridge beam, the pride of his design, snapped in two. The entire roof lifted for a moment, then collapsed inward, crushing his prize-winning cattle and his own hubris in a single, catastrophic failure. Then the snow began. It was a snow unlike any the town had ever seen. It was fine and dry as sand, and it was driven by the relentless wind. It did not fall. It attacked. It filled every crack and crevice. It formed drifts that grew with terrifying speed, burying fences, then sheds, then entire wagons. By the second day, every road out of Providence was gone. The telegraph lines, heavy with ice, had snapped. The railway tracks disappeared under a mountain of white. The train due on November 1st had not arrived. It would not arrive. Providence was cut off from the world. It was an island in a sea of white fury. Inside the Winterfast, life continued in serene, insulated comfort. The shriek of the storm was a distant, muffled hum. A bass note felt more than heard. The temperature inside the stone-walled room held at a steady 52 degrees, even without a fire. When Elara lit her small stove, the space became a cozy haven of warmth and light. She had no need to burn fuel constantly. The thermal mass of the earth around her held the heat for hours. She burned 1, maybe 2 logs a day. She tended to Shale in his connected stall. She read Elias's journals by the steady, clean light of an oil lamp. She cooked her meals, mended her clothes, and listened to the gentle thrum of her own quiet survival. The snow piled up on her sod roof. 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet. It was exactly as the journals had predicted. The great white blanket settled over her, and the Winterfast grew even quieter, even warmer, insulated from the death raging outside by the very substance that was killing the town. For 10 days, the storm raged without pause. In Providence, the situation grew desperate. The initial shock had given way to a grim, cold terror. The town's supply of firewood, stacked in open woodsheds, was buried under 20 feet of snow. Houses that had been built quickly, with thin walls and poor insulation, grew dangerously cold. Food began to run low. The supply train was their lifeline, and it was gone. The first to die was an elderly couple, the Millers. They ran out of wood and froze to death in their beds. Dr. Finch was powerless. His modern house, with its coal-fired furnace in the basement, was useless. The coal shed was inaccessible, buried under a drift the size of a church. His medicines were freezing in their bottles. His own children were shivering, their faces blue in the gloom of their frozen parlour. On the 11th day, driven by a father's desperation, he decided to act. He remembered the mad widow and her folly. He remembered seeing a thin plume of smoke rising from a pipe on her hillside before the storm hit. It was a desperate, impossible chance. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the white hell. The wind nearly knocked him from his feet. The snow was so deep he couldn't walk. He had to crawl and burrow, pulling himself forward in a brutal, exhausting swim. The journey of less than a mile took him 3 hours. He was guided by a single, faint grey wisp against the churning white sky. Smoke. He finally collapsed against a heavy oak door that was set into a mound of snow. He could barely lift his frozen hand to knock. His frantic pounding was feeble, lost in the roar of the wind. The door swung inward. Light and warmth spilled out. A palpable, living thing. Elara Vance stood there, holding a lantern. She looked at the half-frozen, snow-caked creature at her feet. She recognized the town's esteemed doctor, his face a mask of shame, disbelief, and agony. She did not speak. There were no words of reproach, no, "I told you so." She simply stepped aside, held the lantern high, and let him in. She gave him a bowl of hot venison stew and a blanket. He wept as the warmth seeped back into his bones, his sobs the only sound in the room. He was the first. He was not the last. The next day, guided by the doctor, a small, desperate procession of families made the treacherous journey to the hill. They arrived in 2s and 3s, ghost-like figures stumbling out of the blizzard, their faces etched with suffering and the memory of their own foolish scorn. Elara took them all in. Her folly became their ark. The small living space became crowded, but no one complained. They huddled together in the gentle, constant warmth. Elara, with quiet authority, became their leader. She rationed her vast stores of food, ensuring everyone had a hot meal each day. She organized sleeping shifts. She cared for the children, who were terrified, but safe. She moved with a calm competence that shamed them all into silence. She was no longer the mad widow. She was their savior. The last to arrive came on the 15th day of the storm. It was Mayor Thompson and Mr. Abernathy. They were broken men. Abernathy had lost his fortune, his prize cattle, his magnificent barn. The symbol of his pride was now a tomb of splintered wood. Mayor Thompson's authority had vanished, frozen and buried along with his town's sense of order. They stood before her, their heads bowed, unable to meet her steady gaze. Elara looked at these men, the architects of her public ridicule. She saw no triumph in their humbling, only the tragic, inevitable result of pride. She ladled 2 more bowls of stew and gestured for them to find a place on the floor. The Winterfast, once derided as Vance's Folly, now held the 47 survivors of the town of Providence. The storm finally broke after 22 days. A profound, ringing silence fell over a transformed world. The sun emerged, glittering on a landscape of impossible white. When the thaw began and the survivors could finally emerge, they found a town that was not merely damaged, but erased. Many buildings had collapsed. The ones that stood were gutted by the cold. A week later, a town meeting was called. It was not held in the ruined town hall, but in the open air, amidst the wreckage. Mayor Thompson stood before the small crowd. He was a changed man, his waistcoat loose on his thinner frame, his face lined with a grief that went beyond the loss of property. He looked at Elara Vance, who stood quietly at the edge of the gathering.
"I have something to say," the mayor began, his voice hoarse. "We were fools. We were proud and blind, and our pride almost destroyed us." He took a deep breath. "A good woman came to us with wisdom. She tried to warn us, not with words, but with her actions. She showed us the way to survive, and we laughed. We called her work a folly." He looked around at the faces of his fellow survivors, then back to Elara. "You were right, Mistress Vance," he said, his voice clear and ringing with conviction. "And we were wrong. I am sorry. We are all sorry." Dr. Finch stepped forward next. "My science was nothing but arrogance," he admitted. "I read from books, but she read the world itself. Her home was not unhealthy. It was the only healthy place in this entire valley. She saved my children. She saved us all." Then came Mr. Abernathy, his face a ruin of regret. "I built with pride," he said, his voice cracking. "She built with wisdom. The wind took my barn. The snow took my cattle. My pride took my sense. I have nothing left but to thank her for my life and to ask for her forgiveness." All eyes turned to Elara. The crowd was silent, waiting. They expected words of absolution, or perhaps of gentle rebuke. She gave them neither. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over their humbled faces. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice as calm and steady as it had ever been. "Nature does not care for pride. It does not care for apologies. It is a force of reality. Survival is not about being right. It is about being prepared." She paused, letting the words settle. "You have learned a hard lesson. Do not waste it." That was all she said. The town of Providence did not waste the lesson. They rebuilt, but they did not rebuild as they had before. Under Elara's quiet guidance, they began to dig. They built their new homes into the sides of the valley, using the earth itself as their shield. They learned her techniques for construction, for food preservation, for resource management. They learned to watch the sky and listen to the silence of the woods. The phrase, "digging a Vance," was reborn. It came to mean something entirely new. It meant acting with uncommon foresight. It meant choosing wisdom over pride. It meant preparing for the storm in the calm. When we silence those who warn us, we are not punishing them. We are punishing ourselves. Elara Vance never moved from the Winterfast. She never remarried and never sought a place in the rebuilt town's society. She remained on her hill, a solitary sage, a living repository of the old wisdom. She lived for another 40 years, a quiet, revered teacher on the edge of the town she had saved. Children, and then their children, would make the pilgrimage to her door, not with fear or mockery, but with gifts of jam and fresh-baked bread. They would sit at her feet and listen as she taught them how to read the clouds and understand the language of the squirrels. She taught them that the strongest walls were not made of wood or stone, but of humility and knowledge. When she died peacefully in her sleep one warm summer night, at the age of 87, the entire town mourned.
They did not bury her in the town cemetery. They buried her on the crest of the hill overlooking the Winterfast, so she could forever watch over the valley. On the heavy stone lintel above the door to her home, they carved a simple inscription for all future generations to read. It said, "She saw the wind before it blew. Pride is colder than any stone."